All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is Adrian O'Brien, Vice President of Business Development for Midnight Sun, welcoming everyone on the webinar today. Joining you today from New York, so bear with me. Hopefully, we don't have any glitches in internet or anything like that, but we should be smooth sailing. The team is on the call and ready to roll. Kevin's got a great presentation for you today. I'm going to go through a few things kind of thematically and bring everybody up to speed just very quickly before I hand the reins to Kevin to kick off the technical aspect of this. But an exciting time for us. We certainly put out some results last week that are starting to give a clearer view to Dumbwa and what Dumbwa is. And today, certainly, we're going to cover all aspects of this. We're going to give you a deeper dive, and really, the idea behind this call is to give Kevin a chance to talk to you directly, let him dig into the technical aspects of Dumbwa, and really show you how much our understanding of this system has advanced. Now, obviously, we are going to get into some forward-looking statements. Really quickly to cover this off, we're going to be talking about this system. We're going to be talking about Dumbwa, and we're going to be showing you what we think is coming up and where we think this is going, and give you a better sense of that. So just be aware, we're going to cover some forward-looking statements as we go. Now, before we dive into Kevin's technical call, what I want to really quickly touch on, we don't have to spend too much time on this because most of you are familiar with the setting, but I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in Zambia to date. And certainly anybody that's sat through one of my presentations over the last little while has already seen me talk about this. But we talk a lot about the setting and the location of Dumbwa. And really, when you look at the Domes region today, I just want to bring everyone's attention around to what's going on around us because this is really topical right now. And certainly there's more attention being drawn to it all the time. So, as we've moved this asset forward, and certainly now that we're in this phase post-discovery, we're starting to delineate and really understand what Dumbwa is. It's worth bringing attention back to where we're working and looking at the Domes region and why this area is so important today. So, of course, looking at the general setting, we've got Ivanhoe's Kamoa-Kakula, we've got First Quantum Sentinel Mine, we've got Barrick's Lumwana Mine, which we are going to talk about today, certainly in the respect of the comparison to Dumbwa. And we have Kansanshi just a few kilometers away from us. But what's going on in this area is that, of course, we've seen all of the attention on Lumwana, moving Lumwana towards this new super pit that Barrick is underway on, advancing that target towards this $2 billion expansion and certainly globally doubling their output at the end of the day. But some of the other aspects of this that are really, really critical relate to what's going on with these rail lines. And, I think just getting to the heart of what's happening around us, you have now the Lobito corridor underway. And the US government, over the last few months, we've been hearing varied reports of what is happening in terms of funding. The US government is putting up somewhere in the range of $4 billion. I've heard numbers up to 4.4 billion in phased funding. But this is the Lobito corridor. And as you can see, it connects all of these different projects in the region, ours being right in the middle of this, surrounded in green. And this is absolutely critical. What you have developing around us is what I refer to as a perfect storm for M&A. You have all of these major companies working around us. You have other majors and massive copper producers, groups like Rio Tinto, groups like Glencore, groups like BHP and Freeport-McMoRan that are in the area, that are looking around, that are interested in projects. And certainly it comes back to a couple of things. These deposits are very, very large, 1 billion+ tons, and they're right at surface. It's one of the only locations in the world where that's the case. And so what you're seeing is this, sort of a rush to get into the area and for groups to come in. And of course, with Lobito underway, that's putting a lot more attention on the area. But over the last couple of months, I've been talking a lot about the new Chinese rail corridor, which starts at the same point as Lobito, north of Ndola, and runs east through Tanzania to an eastern port. So we've now got this tension between sort of US and China, a global tug of war, if you will, over these copper assets. Now, if you were looking previously at the amount of companies that were there and all of the attention the area is getting, certainly there's going to be increased interest from other companies that are coming out of Asia looking at this area with this Eastern Rail Corridor going in as well. So two rail corridors, increasing the amount of activity in the region, and all of that bodes very, very well for what we're trying to do. And so when Kevin gets into the comparisons today, really think through the lens of the importance of these areas, the importance of location in this camp. And we are the only company in the heart of the camp with a major discovery. And it's been an awfully long time since a discovery of this sort is made. So, the thematic point behind this is a perfect setting for developing a brand new discovery and a new asset, a perfect location, and a perfect setting for M&A down the road, which we've always been very open about that being our target. So where are we today? Kevin's going to show you exactly where we are. We're going to get into the details. We're going to talk about Dumbwa, but I think this really, concisely wraps up where we're at. We have taken Dumbwa from just a conceptual target into what's now a confirmed, very large scale at surface copper deposit. This is a big system. We've done a lot of work over the last little while and really, getting to the heart of how important this discovery is globally. But now it's about not so much whether or not mineralization exists. We're past that point. It's how this sulfide copper deposit sits. What is it? How is it organized? Getting a really solid understanding and looking at those higher grade zones, how they're developing along strike, and just how big this footprint can become. And so, as we develop that understanding, we can really get to the heart of what Dumbwa is. And now we're starting to get that picture. So, of course, the assays out this week speak to the quality of the asset, but they speak to really a tremendous understanding of exactly what we've done over the last 8 or 10 months. Keeping in mind, we started drilling Dumbwa last year in August. So this has been very, very quick. Reaching over 5 kilometers of scale. But I'm going to let Kevin tell you about that. I'm going to hand the reins to Kevin Bonel. Kevin, of course, is our Chief Operating Officer and has driven this discovery. And he's led the team towards something now that we're getting a tremendous understanding on. And today he's going to show you exactly what that understanding is. Kevin, I'm going to turn this off. I'm going to let you share your screen and let's show everybody what you've been working on.
Adrian, thank you very much. Good day, everybody. Okay, let's get started. So I've just created 15 slides, which I think encapsulate the Dumbwa geology, mineralization, and potential fairly well. There will be a Q&A. I'm happy to field any questions that anybody might have during or after the presentation. But what we're going to do is we're going to provide you with a drill progress update. We're going to go through together 2 field logs of 2 new mineralized intercepts north of the now famous copper clearing. We've moved through the copper clearing and we're heading northwards now. We're still hitting pretty interesting material. I'm going to talk around and explain the grade zoning in Dumbwa because I don't think it's something that came through as well as it could have in the press release. And I think that's worth a much, much closer look. We're going to look at 2 or 3 key geological sections and how they fit into the overall geology of the Dumbwa deposit and the schists and the nice tectonostratigraphy. We're going to briefly examine the influence of northwest-southeast structural corridors on the continuity of the north-south mineralization because they do have an effect that is important to understand. Then I'm going to lead you through our conclusions, my team's conclusions to date on the geology, mineralization, and potential of Dumbwa, and also what we're going to be doing as next steps over the next 2 or 3 months. So going into the first slide, let's take a look at the drilling progress. To date, we're on our 223rd hole. We've done 46,732 meters of drilling, which does not include the meters in the ongoing hole. This was a snapshot as of yesterday morning. We've demonstrated 6,250 meters of 6.2 kilometers of mineralized strike. The mineralization is persistent. It's present along the entire strike length that we've tested to date with our drilling. Grades are variable, and we'll look at that in the grade maps. And of course, there's the influence of these northwest southeast structures. But otherwise, it's copper sulfide mineralized schists over the first 6.25 kilometers that we've tested. The drill spacing varies, as you can see on the location map, from 100 meters north-south by 50 meters east-west. In the north, we widened it out a little bit because it's structurally a little bit harder up there than it is in the south. There's some very late brittle faulting, which probably dates to the sag phase of the relaxation of the Lithilian arc during tectonic buildup. And it does offset the ore body from time to time. So some of this drilling is there really. Once we find the ore body, then we move north and south. So I'm not saying all these holes will necessarily be drilled, but at least we are working to a plan. The remaining strike distance we have to complete phase one, which was phase one was always to cover the entire 11.5 kilometers of Dumbwa and demonstrate the presence and continuity of copper sulfide mineralization along its entire length. We've got about 5,600 meters to go on top of the 6,250 meters we've already drilled. The orange and blue and green holes, which we'll be coming back to in a bit, are come to about another 36,000 meters of drilling. We average with 4 rigs around 7,500 meters per month. So we've got about 4 months to go to demonstrate the full potential on this phase one drilling. We have a 5th rig arriving. It got loaded on the flatbed in Ndola today. It should arrive in a couple of days. And we are deploying that immediately onto geometallurgical drilling. We're currently negotiating with Intertek Australia to conduct some metallurgical testing for us on a range of different kind of Dumbwa ore mineralization styles, the higher grade intercepts, the medium grade intercepts, and 1 or 2 from the lower grade intercepts. So we start getting an idea on recoveries, on how this is going to behave in a processing plant, and start answering those very, very important technical questions. So that process is very much about to begin. And finally, just a quick word on assays. We did have issues with the lab, which we have now resolved, mainly revolving around QA/QC and running batches again and again and again until the standards that we inserted came back to the minimum of 1 standard deviation. That seems to have largely revolved itself now, and we're certainly getting much more regular reporting. So to talk about where we're drilling right now, we've drilled through the copper clearing, or otherwise known as the copper kill zone, where there's extremely high copper in soils. The 4 large red dots you can see is where we are drilling right now. That's where the 4 rigs are located. One hole finished today, and the rig is moving a 50 step out west because it encountered very good mineralization. But the important message is the copper sulfide mineralization has continued unabated. We are conducting a ground magnetic survey that's complete now. We're just sending it for processing and interpretation to help us understand some of these late faults, which are offsetting the ore body from time to time by as much as 50, 60 meters maybe. But nevertheless, our hits in the copper clearing and in north of the copper clearing continue to be good. I'm pretty happy with what I'm seeing coming out of the drill program. Not every dart we throw hits the bullseye, but when we do hit it, we see some really, really good stuff. And also the mineralization appears to extend somewhat more west than we modeled and previously expected, which is a good thing. And you can see how those 4 holes are currently in the western part of the drill plan, and that's because we are following some well mineralized schists westwards, and we're going to keep following them until we reach the edge. The DBW 220 we're going to talk about a little bit. Like I said, it's hot off the press. It literally stopped this morning. We do field logs, and I'd like to take you through the field log because it's a good example of some of the surprises that Dumbwa can throw your way. We thought our drill program was pretty good, and then we pick up mineralization in the drill holes, and we start following it, across the strike and following the geology basically, which is always the best thing. And we came out of the overlying soil anomaly, which was always the reason to be interested in this deposit in the first place, was this enormous very east-west constrained soil anomaly. And what we're finding now is the mineralized schists in this particular part of Dumbwa do appear to carry on westwards. You can see from the field log that I've put up on the screen that the mineralization continues to be quite good. So I mean, 44 to 50, it was nice with chalcopyrite. 59 to 80, 21 meters of chalcopyrite and bornite, isolated blebs, and then that goes all the way up to 120 meters to give a total mineralized intercept of 61 meters. And that's where you go into the more classic Lumwana type 2 mica schist with chalcopyrite and occasional blebby bornite. And there is disseminated chalcopyrite present throughout that entire unit. We kept drilling. We went through a quartz vein, which I suspect is one of these faults that I've just been talking about. 122 to 126, a small kind of mica schist. And then we enter another entire lens. So from 128 meters down to 207, which was the bottom of the hole before we stopped it at about 220 this afternoon, we carried on in bornite, chalcopyrite, and chalcocite mineralized 2 mica and biotite schists. So a very, very good hole, and certainly keeps the thing growing northwards. The distance between those two holes, 220 and 221, which we're also going to talk about, is 833 meters. You can see a small infill fence that we've already designed to keep carrying on this westward extension to the mineralization towards the north. And already it's in mineralization. Even though over a distance of 833 meters, we picked up almost immediately, very shallow, 34 meters, 18.1 meters of kyanite schist with bornite lying along the schistofoliation in the plains. We went through some about 10 to 15 meters of more barren material, and then at 66 meters to the bottom of the hole, which was the last report I got, we were back into kyanite schist with chalcopyrite and bornite blebs. So it was a bit surprised how far west this is going, but certainly the copper clearing for now seems to be, and north of the copper clearing seems to be living up to its name. Very, very interesting. Okay, so the geology and geometry of mineralization in the grade distribution shells. So these are all published. All these assays were published in our last press release, but this is how they relate to each other spatially. You've got to find a way to get them to talk to each other and tell you the Dumbwa story. And one of the ways we do that is by examining meter percent, which is the interval, the thickness of the mineralization multiplied by the copper percent. So 6 meter percent would be 6 meters at 1%. It might be 12 meters at 0.5%. It might be 24 meters at 0.25%. It's all 6 meter percent. And what that then allowed us to do is delineate this core, better graded part of the Dumbwa system, surrounded by slightly lower graded material, which is the yellow shell that you can see on your screen. And wrapping the entire kind of zone is a lower grade outer shell, which is where you really are getting down to your 10 meters at 0.15 and 0.2. And we have to drill that shell because otherwise we can't figure out where the edge of our red zone is, our yellow zone is, and our blue zone is. So when you see the significant intercept file, that's really what you're looking at. If you go within the red zone, and you will start to see quite a lot of consistency in terms of thickness and grade between holes, provided you're in the red grade shell. Anywhere you drill, I believe, inside this shell is going to provide you similar grades to what you've seen posted on the screen. So DBW 36 was 44 meters at 0.53. You could question if 42 meters at 0.25% is high grade. It's certainly very thick. It's got a lot of copper, but the grade's 0.25%. But the reason why I put it in is we need a rule. And the rule is, let's see where our 6 meter percent and better material is. And that's why that one's in there. 26.85 meters at 0.53, DBW 007, which was 3 stacked schists. The best one was the deepest one from 100 meters, 39.7 meters at 0.51. Next door to it, DBW 10 was 38 meters at 0.63. DBW 009 on the same line, and this is one of the sections we're going to look at, was 15 meters at 0.98. Then we have 23 meters at 0.49 in 31, 35 meters at 0.51. And then up in the north, this little sliver of higher grade material encapsulated by slightly lower grade material, 32 meters at 0.36 and 17 meters at 0.47. So as long as you stay within that red zone, you are almost certainly every hole you drill, you're going to see something like that from future drilling. So look at the yellow zone, and to give you an idea why we subclassify it from the red zone. This is where you're moving away from the high grade strain, intense copper mineralized core of the system into a more lower strain margin. And you got to remember, just like Lumwana, high strain equals copper mineralization. You need the development of schists, you need the dilation zones to form, you need the microplanes for the later mineralizing event to come through during the Lithilian orogeny. And this is when you start seeing things like 9 meters at 0.41, 5 meters at 0.75. That's not far short of actually 6 meters at a percent. 5 meters at 0.76, 8 meters at 0.49. So you can see the schists are generally thinning. And where they don't thin, and DBW46 is a good example of that, you get 28.5 meters at 0.21. So it brings you in just below the 6 meter percent, but better than 3.5, which is still pretty good mineralization. And then out in the blue zone, I haven't bothered labeling those because they are genuinely low grade, but it does help define the geometry of the ore body. So this is the southern block. You can see how I've divided out the southern block. We have this kind of neck of lower grade material, which is one of the southeast structures that we're going to talk about in the next few slides. And now we're going to jump to the northern, or the central block as we're calling it right now, because we're still south of the copper clearing here. The copper clearing is where our current drilling is. We have a number of assays from this, not complete yet. We're waiting for a few more, but again, some spectacularly graded materials in this central block. Starting from the top, DB149 had 20 meters at 0.76. That was a nice intercept. I think one of the best holes we have from a meter percent perspective is 99R, which was 93 meters at 0.4. And that's one section we're definitely going to have a look at. Out in the yellow zones, you can see I've highlighted a few of the lower grade, sort of, yellow shell of 19 meters at 0.24, 43 meters at 0.2, low grade, but very, very thick mineralization, a lot of tons. DB127, 14 meters at 0.48, there's a 21 meters at 0.33, and so on. I'm sure by now you're getting the message and I can move on. And you can see a couple of holes here that we drilled because we are trying. In some sections, you can see clearly that we stopped short of proving the eastern extent of the mineralization. So we have gone back in on a few lines to try and grow things out eastwards. And you will see from the sections why that's justified. And just a bit more about the lower grade material or the yellow zone material, 19 meters at 0.23, 16 meters at 0.37. That may be a red zone. It's still a very nice intercept. It's comparable with many parts of the ore body at Lumwana. 10 meters at 0.35. That's what we call kind of our medium grade shell. And then the blue shell, obviously, is lower. So to go to the sections, the first section we're going to look at is the first drill fence that we drilled. I know it's not a great scan, and I apologize for that, but you should be able to see it on your screen. Red is simply mineralized schists, color-coded by grade, and gray is the intervening, what they call at Lumwana, internal waste, or just unmineralized material. So it'll be nice. It might be some amphibolite. It can be thin unmineralized schists, but the development of thick schists in the tectonostratigraphy is really what controls the location, intensity, and grade of the copper mineralization at Dumbwa. And you can see going from west to east across this section, which is about 300 meters wide. DB14 had 16 meters at 0.43. DB10 at 38 meters at 0.63. DB20 had two nice intercepts, 9 meters at 0.58, and 12 meters at 0.54. And DB009, 13 meters at 0.41, 15 meters at 0.98. That was a good intercept. And then finally, the lowermost schist, 12 meters at 0.28. And you can see how, as you move away from the central high strain core where the schists developed, And you can see from the section they're generally flat lying, and then they take quite a sharp sort of dip to the east. We see that again and again and again in our sections. The grade tends to fall away and the schist's thin as you move away from the high grade zone. So we do some deep drilling out to the east on some sections to follow these down, where we feel that the thickness of the schists and the grades justifies that. I think the deepest hole we drilled was 358 meters into the east dipping material, and sure enough, it was mineralized at depth. That was up in the copper clearing, by the way. So just to jump a little bit north to give you an idea about why we are returning to drill a few more holes and try and grow some of the mineralized material, certainly in this part of the system out towards the east, is this line in particular. You can see how we stopped the drilling at DBW 25031, but it's got 23 meters of 0.49. So that's why we've planned EXT008, EXT009, EXT006, and EXT007. And that's purely to take that 23 meters at 0.49% further east, just to add more mineralized material to this section and eventually the overall Dumbwa resource. That's a good example of that, actually. And there's a few lines like that. So jumping into the northern or the central block, I should say, which you know is now north of the southern block that we've just examined. This is what it looks like in cross section, and that's a clearer image. Multiple schist development, including a major blowout in 99R of 93 meters at 0.44, and I can't help but wonder if that's analogous to the Roan and Equinox ore shoots in Chimiwungu. And also we had a couple at Lubwe as well, known as Kamisenga now, at Lumwana, where you get these sudden enormous thickenings of the schist and huge jumps in grade. So the 0.44 is because this is a fully diluted intercept. We've included the internal waste into this intercept. But and fundamentally, I've never found a way to predict them. Maybe there is a way to predict them, but they can occur anywhere in the ore body. They may not be particularly long north-south, but boy, do you get a good hit when you find one. And again, you can see very clearly in the assay results moving from west to east how you come from a relatively low-grade, thin schist development into a high-strain zone where the schists thicken. You get a lot more dilation, you get a lot more copper mineralization. Then you see that easterly dip come into play, and the grades tend to fall off quite sharply as you move away from that central core zone, from your red zone, which is why the yellow zone is such a narrow wrap around it, and the blue's a little bit wider, but then again, blue goes down to 0.1 cutoff, which is the same geological cutoff that Lumwana uses. So we decided to employ the same, really as a geological tool more than a resource tool. So some of these are still awaiting assay results. We have a few assays from further north coming soon, but these ones are pending any time, and that's 145, 142, and 146. I'm not expecting much from those. I think we've got the assays from the core of this thing, and as you can see, some of them are pretty impressive intercepts. Okay, so let's have a summary of the geology of Dumbwa. Geologically and mineralogically, it's indistinguishable from Lumwana. You can argue that there are some differences in the geometry. Chimiwungu is a reasonably, shallow dipping, south dipping sequence of stacked mineralized schists with internal waste, which is what we've got. Our dip is, more off to the east where we do have dips, and they don't have that sort of steep drop off east dip at the east of them, but geometrically there's some differences, but geologically and mineralogically, we're just not seeing the same. And not only that, the intercepts that we reported in the PR that I'll just show you are highly comparable with what they drill at Lumwana day to day. We're using similar cutoffs mainly for geological model at the moment. We haven't started an MRE yet, but we are planning to fairly soon on that southern portion of the ore body, because we got such clear grade zoning, along and across strike. So if you want it summarized in a paragraph, Dumbwa is a strike extensive sequence of copper sulfide mineralized biotite and 2 mica biotite and muscovite schists within a barren gray and pink gneissic package that are gently dipping eastwards or flat lying. The soil anomaly coincides with the east dipping schists where they come to surface. Occasional southeast trending structures disrupt schist development, resulting in thin, weakly mineralized schists. Where strain conditions are ideal, the schists can blow out, very similar to the Lumwana ore shoots, like 99R, my favorite hole. These blowouts for now are unpredictable and possible anywhere outside of these southeast structural corridors, I think is a fair conclusion. And this is what I'm talking about when I allude to these southeast structural corridors disrupting schist development and therefore disrupting copper mineralization. So if you take the resistivity, this is the 1025 RL resistivity, you can clearly see these corridors cutting through the bright white resistivity, which seems to largely define where the mineralization is. This is where we're drilling right now, and we're getting good results. And you can see we're in this resistive zone here, and then you have these zones of resistivity, which cut southeast from northwest to southeast, and they largely eliminate economic mineralization, shall I say. We do have copper schists in them, but they tend to be thin, weakly developed, and fairly poorly mineralized, up to a point we're lucky if we see 0.1, 0.15 from some of these holes. But we do know about these now. We do understand them in a way that we didn't before. And so when we get into the northern one, we'll probably put a couple of holes in. I fully expect to see something similar, and those two fence lines will be dropped out of the drill program, and we'll focus on where we know we have better material to chase. So that's those explained in basic, very, very simply. We don't really know what causes these structural corridors. It's not silicification. If anything, the rocks are softer and more altered, which leads us to believe that they are probably structural in nature. And but we'll go back and revisit these one day in the future. At the moment, the focus is on just keep growing this thing, particularly to the east, a little bit to the west, and carrying on to the north. So final slide, and then we're on to Q&A. Conclusions and what's next. What can we safely conclude from 46,000 meters of drilling, detailed geological modeling, observations on the core? Well, I think these are fair conclusions. Dumbwa is now, without doubt, a very large copper mineralized system. Grades form distinct zones of better intercepts, greater than 6 meter percent, as you've seen, a weaker wrapping envelope of 3.5 to 6 meter percent, and then weak, less than 3.5 meter percent outer enclosing zone. Mineralization is generally very shallow. We see a lot of it start immediately at the surface. All our holes have to be assayed from 0 meters because one of the high tenor of copper in the soils, and two, because we in most instances we go straight into mineralized schists. And there is occasional weak north-south orientated flexure, which does take the schists a bit deeper, and that's normally reflected in the overlying soil geochemistry. And when I say a bit deeper, down to 50 to 60 meters before your first intercept from surface. And there's probably some faulting control as well. But the faults are very difficult to model unless you're lucky enough to hit one with your core. The mineralized package itself varies along strike between 100 meters and 250 meters thick, where it's flat lying, and then it can go down to very quickly down to 380 when it takes that sort of 30 to 45 degree easterly dip on the eastern edge of the system. The mineralization host is mostly flat lying to gently dipping kyanite metasomatized biotite and muscovite schists separated by barren grey gneiss rafts and boudins, exactly the same as what you see in Lumwana. There's no difference. Persistent copper sulfide mineralization has been drill demonstrated now over the first 6.2 kilometers of strike, and we expect it to continue to at least the end of the main soil anomaly for a total of 11.5 kilometers total strike. I can't rule out further northward growth at this stage. That's just where the main soil anomaly ends, and then it becomes quite a subtle soil anomaly. Maybe the mineralization weakens, stops, or it goes a bit deeper and there's barren material separating the mineralized schists from the overlying soil. I'll know that when we get there. So you could say that the mineralization opens northwards, remains open northwards along strike. There are eastward growth opportunities, and in the copper clearing with today's drilling, literally, we appear to be showing significant west growth opportunity as well. And of course, the late northwest southeast orientated structural corridors do negatively influence schist development and subsequent copper intercepts, but luckily they're not too long. I mean, they're less than 900 meters of strike, and they haven't eliminated a great deal of Dumbwa. So what's next? What's the plan? Well, for the next 3 or 4 months, we are going to carry on the northward extension drilling until we get to the full 11.5 kilometers. We need to begin an inferred MRE on the southernmost grade block. All the assays are in for that block, and there's really no reason apart from maybe waiting for the eastward extension of drilling to begin, putting some proper numbers to it. We need to follow the westward mineralized schists. It was a pleasant surprise in the copper clearing and parts of the north parts of the copper clearing, and keep that fence going out at 50-minute steps until the mineralization runs out. We need to infill the 833-meter gap between 220 and 221 to test the continuity of that same kind of westward extent. We need to complete the expansion drilling. There's not a lot of that to do. Most of it's in the southern block anyway, to see if we can grow the red grade shell and add some more mineralized material in the south. We're about to begin geometallurgical testing. The rig's on its way. We've already picked the holes that we want to reproduce. What we're really doing now is finalizing things with Intertek in terms of sample tonnage that they want in order to properly process and give us a better idea of what our metallurgy is going to be. And the target remains the same. It hasn't changed since the last webinar or anything. We expect to complete the phase 1 drilling by the end of August, especially with the addition of the 5th rig when it comes off geomet sampling. And then we'll start working our way back south and start the phase 2 infill, particularly in the north, based on according to need. If we've drilled if we've drilled a fence 250 to 300 meters north south, then and we know where the mineralization is, there's no reason not to go and infill it and join the dots. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I hope that's giving you a better understanding of Dumbwa beyond what the press release says. And I'm going to hand back to Adrian now, who will run the Q&A.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Kev. Certainly, that was a pretty good deep dive. You can either leave your screen up if you like, so that we can refer to your slides if there's questions about geology. And definitely, Kevin, leave your mic on, because we're going to probably let you answer a bunch of these as we go along. So
I'm right
far,
here.
any questions need to come in through the Q&A tab. I do have a couple of questions here, so we're going to work our way through these as they come in. Encourage you to put your questions in there, and we'll try to get to as many of these as we can. Right off the bat, I've got one question from James Shelley that came in about 10 minutes ago, maybe even a little longer than that. We had a question here about the expectation to complete phase 1 within 4 months or so, and a question about assay reporting along that line. In other words, are we going to receive assays within that 4-month period? The assays are coming in on an ongoing basis. So the delays we've dealt with have been related to QA/QC issues. They have nothing to do with overall timeline. So we do get a timeline from our lab. We have an expectation of how long that's going to take. But at this point, we do expect assays to roll within that period. So completing this by August, within that time frame, we should be receiving results unless there's any QA/QC issues that we catch. But that's the expectation. Kevin, would you say that's accurate from your standpoint?
I think that's fair. They're performing a hell of a lot better than they were. A lot fewer rejects now. I'm not saying there's no rejects, but there's a couple, but not to the extent it caused the horrific delays that it did since February. Really, the issue started in February. We've got them fixed largely, and also we're using 2 labs now, not just one. We're splitting samples between SGS and Intertek, and big improvement. I'm a much happier COO now, and you can expect much more regular updates as the assay results roll in.
Excellent. We have a question here from Andrew Neal regarding our estimated all-in drilling costs per meter. They were about 160. Has that changed at all, Kev? Or are we right on the money with 160 still?
No change.
No change. Perfect. Another question from James Shelley. Do we see any impact on fuel availability yet from the situation in Iran?
Not yet. We had a fuel shortage, which was mainly due to stations hoarding in anticipation of price rises. And certainly the price of fuel has gone up. But that was quite short term. The Energy Regulation Board stepped in and put a stop to that, and there's been no notable fuel shortages recently. I can't speak to the future. The energy market's not one of my areas of expertise,
Yeah, yeah,
but everything
of
seems
course.
pretty stable and okay right now.
Of course. So we got a question here from Hans regarding Dumbwa consisting of multiple separate resource blocks rather than one continuous thing. And I think what we're starting to understand, and Kevin, maybe I'm simplifying it, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. We've got this very large footprint that continues for an immense strike length, and then sections that are higher grade, medium grade, and lower grade. So the idea is to isolate those pockets that are most consistent. And so what Hans is asking is, at what point does this project become attractive enough for a major to make an approach? Certainly, we can't comment on any conversations that are happening or anything like that. But with regard to critical scale, we always look at this and we set a target right out of the chute of reaching 1 billion tons. And I think, it's safe to say that if you can reach that kind of critical mass, you do have a target that would stand out in a region like this and probably globally from the perspective of size. And I think you can get to a target that would make sense for M&A for somebody out there. And do you want to add anything to that, Kevin, or Matt or Al or anybody else that's on here?
I think the only thing I'd add is, asking us what the eventual grade might be is not really a fair
Oh,
question,
exactly.
because it's going to depend on where you put your pit. I
Hmm.
mean, if you only want to mine the red material, then you're gonna drop a tons, but you're gonna get better grades. If you want to go out to the yellow shell, the yellow envelope, you're adding significant tons at the slight expense of grade. And if you want to try and grab it all, you're looking at a hell of a lot of tons at fairly low grade, by comparison with other mines. So it's not really a fair question at this stage. I'd rather leave that for the resource geologists. I think it's a fair comment that certainly, from the southern results, it does look like it's going to be, two main areas to mine, separated by this lower grade neck. It's way too early to tell for the copper clearing and
Yeah.
northwards.
Yeah, we've
All I
got a
can
lot
say
of
is that the drilling is
I
looking
think you hit
encouraging.
on I think you hit on something really important there, Kevin, that I think we need to express to people is that what you're looking at today is only not even a quarter of the potential strike length of Dumbwa.
Mhm.
So, we're advancing, getting up around the 6 kilometer mark. The initial target is the first 11 and a half kilometers. We do have an entire northern extension we still need to explore. That's going to require geochem, it's going to require geophysics, it's going to require drilling. The point being, we have a massive amount of strike to go and explore still. This is only the very early beginning, and we're already reaching very extensive strike length and scale. So you're seeing a very big system being advanced, being moved out and delineated, if you will. So this is just the very beginning phase, and we've got a long way to go. There can be lots of twists and turns, and lots of upside opportunity ahead. So I'm going to get into a question from Pierre. Pierre, I think this is getting into talking about the system at depth. Pierre is asking about talking about the root system and what this could look like in 3D. It's Kevin. I will throw that over to you because you're certainly the guy to answer on the geological side. But
I
I
mean, we've started on Saturday morning, actually. We hired a resource geologist who's highly experienced at deriving 3D models, and we'll have something at least in the southern half where we've got the assay results to justify a 3D model.
yes,
We will start putting that together, but really the sections tell you as much as you need to know about the 3D of this deposit. The schist will continue like this going northwards. You jump 400 meters north. You can see very, very similar geometry for the schists, multiple schist development in an overall grey gneiss to pink gneiss package. And then you get this abrupt, and we see it quite often actually, you get this abrupt steepening of the dip off to the east, but again, the system tends to weaken. And we don't really do a lot of testing below 220, 230 meters, Pierre, because we just drill the occasional deep strat hole out to the east to test the validity of the model and confirm this steeply east dipping portion of the system. But the main part of the system I think we need to focus on is the flat lying core. That's our focus for now. That's what we need to get all the way up to the 11.5 kilometer mark. And then phase two, we can come back and start thinking about, the kind of, the more deeper roots of this thing. So that's our strategy at the moment. Yeah, I agree, Pierre. It's geologically interesting. How deep does this thing go? Does it go all the way to the Moho? I don't know. But certainly on that eastern limb where it's dipping, where we have drilled 380, 390 meters, we still see the schists more or less where they should be, following that steep dip down. And on the majority of the ore body, I suspect that geometry is not going to change.
Excellent. Look, we've got a few questions from Pierre. And given Pierre's support and of course Haywood's support, let's go through a few of these and get to the bottom of some of these things that he's looking at. And I think some of these are really good questions. He's asking about mineral zonation, and it's probably a great thing to explain to people how the zonation of this system looks. Can you maybe explain that in sort of a visual sense, Kevin, what the mineral zonation for copper looks like at Dumbwa?
Yeah, so I mean, the center red core, I'm in the slide here, right now, is a great example. The central red core running down the middle of this thing is where you will see bornite and chalcocite.
Yes.
That's where we get our spectacular grades, particularly in the south of Dumbwa, but really running all the way through to the north. We know when we're in the core of the system because we're seeing bornite and chalcocite in the core, and that's where the grade jumps up substantially. And then as you move away from that, the bornite and chalcocite gently falls away, and chalcopyrite becomes the dominant sulfide phase
Mhm.
until it's the only sulfide phase. And of course, the copper sulfide phase with the least amount of copper is chalcopyrite, and then bornite, and then the high one, which is literally Cu2S, is chalcocite, and chalcocite will always give you a kick. And that's the east to west zonation we see is bornite, chalcocite in the middle. East and west, you go into a chalcopyrite dominant to 100% phase zone, and then that will fade away to nothing or sometimes become pyrite. In terms of north-south, as long as you've got this high grade schist development, thick schists, you find this north-south strip. It's usually about 100 meters wide, occasionally a bit more, occasionally slightly less. So 100 meters is an average of bornite chalcocite dominant mineralization that changes the zones to chalcopyrite east and west quite quickly. So, I mean, you could say, all right, well, on this map, is the red really mapping bornite and chalcocite? And the answer is, yeah, it probably is. I've not really looked at it from that perspective, but it wouldn't be far off. And then the yellow zone, coincidentally, chalcopyrite's yellow is where we get a lot of chalcopyrite, and the grades fall away. And then blue is low grade or low disseminations of chalcopyrite. So I hope that answers the question about zoning.
Yeah, I think that's great, Kev. The other question Pierre had here was regarding geochem. So, if I'm not mistaken, we are carrying out geochem or carrying out geochem ahead of the drilling in order to fill in areas where there's previous multi-generations of geochem. Is that right? Or maybe you can
That
explain
that
in more
is
detail.
that is entirely correct. So the
Yeah,
geochem stays just ahead of the drilling, and it does help us site our boreholes, but
yeah,
there's a bit of topography and it gets a little bit more rugged up north. And so you get dispersion and you get soil creep. So although we do use it, sometimes it's not the most reliable. It's better used in conjunction with other data channels like IP. So where we get an IP chargeable zone in section, coincident with high copper in soil, then we drill with a lot more confidence than we do when those two things are decoupled. I mean, look, the IP program works really, really well. I mean, if we drill high IP, on the trend, generally speaking, we find copper sulfides, but not every time. So
yeah,
sometimes it's due to pyrite, sometimes it's due to magnetite, and that's why you use your geochemistry to try and filter out your kind of red herring IP chargeable zones in your section. And of course, we've also noted that geochemistry, whilst it's been very, very good at reflecting almost one-to-one the tenor and quality of copper mineralization in the bedrock under the soils, it's
mhm,
not foolproof. And that really tells the story about the westward extension in the copper clearing that we're drilling right now.
yeah,
And finding, kyanite schists mineralized with bornite and chalcopyrite. It's covered with 40 meters of barren gneiss.
yeah.
That's a lot of barren rock to get a geochemical signal through. And I mean, we're moving away there on that part of the system. Not saying it happens everywhere. On that part of the system, the geochemistry in the soils is really weak. but go down 40 meters and you're seeing really nice sulfide mineralization. Now, I don't mean it's going to be great grades. I refuse to commit to that at this stage. I'll wait for the assays. But certainly, I like what I'm seeing from those holes. And it was a bit of a surprise because although there was a bit of IP there, which gave a clue, there was really no overlying geochem. So I would say good guide, not a silver bullet.
Yeah, I think that's really well encapsulated. We had a question here from somebody anonymous asking about cash, what our cash position is, where we're sitting today, and about raising money. We are in a great position. You know, we raised 30.5 million at $1.35 back in October. As we touched on in the presentation, the drill cost in Zambia is incredibly, incredibly low. It might be the lowest I've ever seen actually on projects I've worked on throughout my career. We're looking at about 160 all in per meter. So incredibly, incredibly low, which means our cash goes a long way. So we're sitting on around 25 million today. We're in great shape. We have a lot of drilling to do between now and the end of August, but even that's going to leave us with a significant amount of cash in the bank. And we have no need to go out and raise money. So we're in really, really great shape. And of course, we are underway in our plan to monetize Kaziba, which I think is going to give us an opportunity to avoid future funding and do so in a non-dilutive way where we can continue to have the cash to advance Dumbwa without going out and having to raise money in the open market. So it's a great plan, it's a great strategy, and we're going to keep on that path. I think it's the best way to go. We had a question here about stopping drilling today. So this was from you know somebody here. Just I cannot see the name for whatever reason. It's really strange. It's on Andre Kowalski. Question was, if we stop drilling today, hypothetically, how big is Dumbwa? Look, we can't comment on that. Just going to be perfectly blunt. We can't comment on size. We can't put tonnage to something before we complete the proper studies in order to do that. But what you can do is you can look at comparables, you can look at strike length. I would encourage people to understand Lumwana, look at technical reports and take a read, understand what that system looks like, and just get some ideas. There's not a lot of comparable basement dome hosted deposits out there to look at. Of course, given Kevin's extensive work at Lumwana, he's giving you all a really good sense of the comparables and why we're doing that. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, it's not something we can really comment on until we get to that point. But what we do know is we have a huge amount of strike length, getting up to 6+ kilometers now, and an extensive system that's continuous, that we can see the mineralization, understand the mineralization, and start to look at what kind of tonnage we're looking at. Kevin, maybe you can answer this. When Pierre is asking about the fact that Dumbwa is flat lying, if a deposit like this in basement dome is flat lying, then what constrains it, or why would it be narrow by comparison, or would it extend further? I guess what we're seeing now is extension beyond where we originally thought, particularly with those fence extensions you're about to go out and do. But maybe you can just comment in a little bit more detail on that.
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not going to cop out and say refer to the Lumwana geological model, which would answer that question quite nicely, actually.
Yeah.
Look, ultimately at this stage right now, Pierre, the most honest answer I can give you is we don't know how far laterally this thing goes. We
Yeah.
weren't expecting this westward drilling. It's a very pleasant surprise. I mean, we were drilling the holes, hoping to close off the mineralization we drilled on east along that drill fence. And suddenly we went straight into really nice material, and we're just going to follow it and hope it goes on forever. That's the best answer I can give right now. I'm not entirely sure I understood the question, but in terms of lateral extent of this flat-lying system, the honest answer right now, Pierre, is I don't know. I suspect it's wider than we think it is, or I think more correctly to say wider than our current model says it is. But that's the good thing about models. You can change them according to what you get from your drilling.
Totally fair. That was good, Kev. Thank you. So I have a question here from Ian Herbernson. He's asking, are the unmineralized gneiss units between the mineralized schist lenses generally thinner or thicker than what is seen at Lumwana?
No, I'd say about the same.
Yeah.
About the same. Yeah, about the same. I mean, they pinch and swell. You get the odd big raft and you get lots of little rafts. Again, it depends, what part, it depends what your drill core's gone through.
Yeah.
But certainly, in the early days of Lumwana, I worked with the pre-feasibility at Lumwana, back in the early 2000s for when I was with Equinox. And we didn't really understand or suspect the kind of the boudinage, the isolated gray gneiss rafts separating the mineralized schists from each other. And that was never really understood until Lumwana actually became a mine. And you could see these things in the pit wall. And that was when I think the penny dropped for me about how these things develop, how they form, the regime under which they happen, the stage at which the mineralized fluids coming through, the relationship between the schists and the internal waste, the kind of barren gneiss rafts and boudins. And I think we're being a little bit harsh calling them barren gneisses because actually, on occasion, not always, they can be quite more mineralized. There is some leakage into them from the hanging wall and footwall schists. But generally speaking, yeah, gun to my head, I'm failing to see any difference between this deposit and Lumwana. And that alludes directly to your question.
Excellent. Thanks, Kev. So we've got a couple of questions here that all tie together. So these are regarding the last drill results, market reaction to last drill results, and I think that Hans actually put this well, which is, what do you think the market misunderstood? I'm going to add a couple of things, and then I'm going to throw it to you, Kevin, to talk about the understanding between what you see and what this all means versus how the market may have understood it. And I think there's a couple of things at play with the last news release. I think one was the timing of results and the delays in getting assays out. That doesn't help the situation. And of course, if you look at our QA/QC protocols, they're doing their job. The idea is to capture any issues that come up. And we did do that, and we caught those issues, and we were able to remedy them. But it doesn't explain the delays at SGS Zambia that we had to deal with, and that was very frustrating for obviously everybody involved. But looking at the actual drill results, looking at where we're sitting today, Kevin, do you think that people misunderstand where this is sitting today? Or when you look at it from your perspective, you're obviously very excited. You see something developing to a very, very large system. What do you think people might misunderstand about this?
I think context.
Yes.
Context. When you look at a long list of drill results and you see things like 20 meters at 0.15 and
Yeah.
25 meters at zero point 0.2, I mean, without really going into the higher grade material that we have, and we certainly have that, you lose context. You need to know, to make an assessment, you need to know spatially where those holes are. And I think the penny might have dropped for an awful lot of people on this call who would have read that press release and seen those results and thought, oh, grades are desperate. When you actually see the grades in context, when you see that we've drilled in the low grade blue zone, the medium grade yellow zone, the better graded red zone, that's how it all fits together. And I don't think you can just look at a list like that and draw conclusions. You've got to understand it spatially, how they relate to each other, how they relate to the geological model, how they relate to the grade model, how they relate to the mineralization model, and then you get a map like you see on your screen right now to the left. So, I
Yeah.
mean, if you look at the northern fence on that map, DB 72, 79, 81, 71, they're all going to appear in the same part of the table. They're all going to be low grade. And that's because that fence went into a low grade part of the system. And if you're going to prove a system, if you're going to understand the geometry and you're going to understand your model, unfortunately, sometimes you've got to drill the good and the bad, that you understand all of it. Because if we didn't go out and drill the 0.1, 0.2 shell, which is defined by the blue envelope, we wouldn't know there was a blue envelope. It would look like almost a north-south fault-hosted deposit
Yeah.
instead of, flat-laying schists. So
Really.
I think context was the main issue there, and understanding how what you're reading in that table relates to what's going on the ground. And I hope this cleared a lot of that up in people's minds.
Absolutely. Well, that's why these are so valuable, Kev. It's great to get you online and give everybody a chance to talk to you and give you a chance to explain it with the important geological context that really frames what the system is becoming. We've had a couple of questions around the mechanics of the straining system. We've been getting, I see Pierre's asking some questions here about strain. So for me to put it in really layman's terms first, I'm going to let Kevin obviously explain it. But what the reference is regarding is Kevin has explained that these are strain-related deposits. So this is a deposit that's formed through strain rather than chemistry. In areas where you get the most strain, you get the most copper deposition. That's really the way I understand it. That's certainly the way we've been through it. But Kev, let's hear the really proper technical explanation of how these are formed in comparison.
Okay, so I mean, the only way to form a schist is enormous amounts of tectonic strain, movement. So the rocks crumble, they break, they go through a process we call cataclasis and mineralization, and they recrystallize. So your original bands of feldspar and amphibole and under strain will break up, recrystallize, and form schists, which are heavily foliated, rocks, strongly foliated rocks, where the dominant minerals are no longer feldspar and quartz and amphibole. They've now become biotite and muscovite. Platy, flaky. They're the only things that can really grow under these very high strain conditions, under these tectonic conditions. And so and they form around the boudins. And you can almost imagine the formation of a schist in an environment like this, like a river flowing around a boulder. And where the river touches the boulder is going to be a lower pressure zone than where the river is roaring between boulders. And it's that change, it's that dropping down your pressure graph more than anything else. Temperature won't change much, but pressure will. So where the schists are forming against these incompetent rafts and boudins of gneiss is where the copper will eventually precipitate in the lower grade zones. To form a schist, you've got to form microplanes. It's going to dilate. You're going to get micro dilations forming that kind of all link up into a single system. And you need that in order for the copper bearing fluids to penetrate these ancient crystalline gneisses in order to form a mineral deposit. And that's why we have 75 to 80% of our mineralization is within the schists on either side of gneissic waste. And that's really is the model. And between the boudins would be a low strain zone, right up against the boudin, same as water slows down immediately where it contacts, an immovable object. Those are your lowest strain zones. And that's where the copper will tend to precipitate. And actually, if you look at the grades in this section, where you can see the reds and yellows, you can see how they tend to accumulate in the immediate contacts between the schist and the gneiss and inside the schist. So you can see that relationship. And that is the relationship.
That's excellent, Kev. That was a really, really, really great example of how this works. Good explanation. Quick question from Pierre, but I think you answered this in your initial presentation. Are all assays being done at Intertech now? I think there is still material with
No,
SGS. Is that correct?
no, well, SGS removed the improvement at SGS has been dramatic.
Yeah.
I don't want to hammer them and hit them too hard. They've worked really, really hard to get their house in order. I think that deserves reward, not punishment. So at the moment, we're content to use both if we
Yes.
get faster assay reports in return. And
Okay.
that's exactly what we're seeing right now.
Excellent. Rod has a question here that's more from my side, asking about our last financing and just a sense of who our institutional shareholders are, what we're doing to expand that. Um, you know, we have a really great roster of institutional shareholders. When I first joined the company in 2023, we looked at that as part of the overall plan. Part of the plan was to advance the institutional ownership of Midnight Sun, and we've gone from having no institutional ownership to well over 30% institutional ownership. And when you look at the breakdown of that financing in October 2026 or 2025, sorry. That 30.5 million was largely institutional. I think there was 15 individual funds in there, and some very big funds that led the financing. So, having a sense of who they are, we know who they all are. I'm in constant contact with all of them. We're basically we all have a pretty close relationship, and making sure that they're getting the information they need. And to answer your question about support, they've been hugely supportive, and they're showing that. So, we want to obviously grow that relationship. We want to bring additional institutional shareholders in. And it's a big part of why I'm out on the road on a regular basis, meeting with those groups, keeping them in the loop, and continuing to bring in additional institutional owners, and particularly groups that will step into the open market and build their position, which is exactly what we see from those current shareholders that are institutional, where they're stepping up on a constant basis and supporting the deal. So we're really, really happy with the way that that's unfolded and just what we've managed to do as this has advanced. Looking at a couple of these other questions, we're getting some pretty technical questions, Kev, and some stuff that just going to caution everybody. There's lots of questions we're getting on things we can't comment on. So if you feel like I'm avoiding a question, certainly not avoiding anything. But the reality being, if we're getting questions around tonnage, we haven't completed a resource. We can't really comment on tonnage right now, but what we can comment on
Grade.
is strike length. We can comment on geometry. We can comment on what we've accomplished and certainly draw some parallels. So trying to get to the right geological data, you guys can really draw things from here and understand it better. What I can say, there's a question here about strip ratio. Again, we're not there yet. We can't talk about strip ratio at Dumbwa, but what we can talk about is Lumwana and maybe Kevin's experience. I don't know, Kev, if you've got a handle at all on how the strip ratio works at Lumwana or what they're dealing with, but maybe you can comment a bit on that.
Only what only what they published in
Yeah,
in their technical reports and annual
exactly.
reports,
Yeah.
and their strip ratio varies between 3.1 and 4.2,
Yeah, and I think what's
right in
really
that range.
interesting is looking at their cutoff, right? Their cutoff grade, correct me if I'm wrong, 1%, 1.3%, and 1.6%, depending on what particular resource you're looking at. Can you comment on those a little bit?
Okay, I'm gonna correct you.
Yeah.
0.1%
Sorry,
geology,
0.1%. Thank
point
you.
yeah, around 0.13 for resource and 0.16 reserve,
Yeah,
give or
so there
take.
you go. Excellent. Thanks, Kev.
It should really be updated regularly according to the copper price. That's what you base your cutoff on. But give or take, yeah, that's about what's used.
Excellent. There's another question here about widening of the geochem anomaly as we go north. There is a couple of areas, we typically refer to them as blowout areas, Kev, but
Yeah.
at this point, we're not there yet. We haven't drilled them yet. There's not a lot we can say. Am I right? But they are definitely blowing out in terms of the geochem that we see on the map. Anything
Okay.
else
All
you can
right.
add to that?
So here's what I think. All right. Now we're going down speculation alley. Here's what I think. That geochem blowout in the north, as you've seen in the sections that I've popped up, and this is a great section for showing that. Dumbwa takes a kind of steep easterly dip towards the eastern edge of the system. If that easterly dip doesn't happen and it stays flat lying a bit longer, you're going to get a much wider schist at surface. And I think that's probably your blowout. I just think that part of the system, you're not seeing this steep easterly dip. Look, we'll know when we get there and we drill it. But to put my head on the block today in this webinar, I think that's all that's happening. It's purely geometry driven.
Yeah, that's totally fair. We've got time here for a couple more. I know we're getting pretty close to wrap up time. We're well over an hour now, so we'll get into one or two more here, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. We do have a question here that I actually really like the direction this is going in terms of getting a little bit into the political setting in Zambia. And we're looking at policy context. So the question here is from Chris Roberts, and Chris is asking if the Zambian elections coming up on August 13th might create any short-term operational challenges or concerns about mining policy campaign, and questions about President Hichilema here looking to win a second term. And I think that's accurate. Kevin, you're on the ground in Zambia. How would you comment on the political environment and what's going on with the election coming up?
Look, I'm not a political commentator. I'm going to stick to what I think the effect it will have on our program.
Yeah,
I'm certainly no CNN news anchor, that's for sure. I mean, look, in my past experience, I've been here 30 years,
yeah,
and there's very little disruption, really. There's the usual rallies and road blockages, and of course, on election day, we will give everybody. It'll be a day of no work. It'll be no drilling. We'll give everybody the opportunity to go and cast their vote, which is the right thing to do, and that is the only disruption I am expecting. Historically, elections in Zambia have been very peaceful, very good natured, and I see no reason for this one to be any different than any one I've experienced before.
yeah, exactly. And I think it really speaks to the whole thing. Just when you look at President Hichilema and just the amount of effort he puts in to marketing in country, how much he's out there. I know there's been site visits at numerous locations with some of the majors in the belt over the last while, and President Hichilema has been there. He's put his time in speaking, and he's not shy about his goal to be a much bigger global producer than Zambia currently is. So that part is definitely pretty exciting. So, I think it's a very, very positive positive plan. And there was a question here about nationalization. There's no history of that in Zambia, so obviously not a piece that we're looking to. What we're looking at here is just there's a couple of questions left. We're getting pretty far over time. I just want to get to a couple more though. So if Kev, if you can hang on for a second. Um,
Sure, no worries.
one question here that we did have was from somebody asking about, let's see here. So currently, I think I'm going to break this into two pieces, but really, we're looking at overall strike length here. Would it be safe to say that we have an overall strike now of over 6 kilometers, and then the structural corridors represent smaller sections in between? Is that correct?
Yep, you got that spot on. So
So,
of the six point, I
yeah,
mean, of the 6.25 kilometers that we've tested and demonstrated, persistent copper sulfide mineralization, even the structural corridors have copper sulfide mineralization. It's just that the schists didn't develop as well as everywhere else, so you don't get the nice thick intercepts that you see in the core. I mean, they probably of the 11.5, I would say they probably maybe eliminate at most 1.5, 1.6 kilometers. It's just going to be kind of, two corridors that, are sub-economic mineralized corridors. And that's really what breaks this up into, its individual packets, I suppose you could say, or resources. But I think the key message there is that we know about them and we understand them and we know how to deal with them now. That's
yeah,
something we didn't know last time we had this webinar. We didn't know what the shifts were doing inside those zones. We didn't know what the grades were going to be like inside those zones. The copper anomaly, funnily enough, bangs right through them as if it's not there.
yeah,
But that's the dispersion I was talking about in a previous question that Pierre asked. So the copper anomaly largely is unaffected by these zones, but certainly, and that gives you the encouragement to drill them, doesn't it? But
absolutely.
certainly when we drilled them, yeah, I mean, we were disappointed. We're following these great thick packages of mineralized schist and getting all excited. Then we crossed over whatever controls this thing, and straight away everything kind of, went dead on us. So we know they're there. We know they're not great, but they are the minority of this thing. They're certainly not the majority of it.
Excellent. So I think we've got time here for one more. We're getting pretty close to the wire. And I've had a couple questions in here on this, and I'm trying to balance them so we're not regurgitating the same technical data over and over. So I'm going to ask you this one a little bit differently because I think it'll provide context. And Donald, just so you know, this is referring to your question, but we've kind of hit on this a few times and in Kevin's presentation as well, just in terms of overall grade. And keeping in mind, we haven't published a resource, so we can look at the resource. Study down the road and kind of think about what we're sitting on today in terms of the detail we're gathering within these grade shells that Kevin is referring to and what we're starting to see taking shape. But I'm going to flip it because Donald's asking a good question, which is that how does grade compare at Lumwana? Like, what are they dealing with at Lumwana? We know that Lumwana is listed as a 0.5 average, but if I'm not mistaken, we know there's three separate deposits there. We've got Chimiwungu, Lubwe, and Camaranda, if I'm not mistaken. How do they look in terms of grade? Are they consistent from one to the next? Are those deposits different from one another, Kev? Maybe you can comment on what they look like a little bit from your own history and work there.
Yeah, I mean, very, very comparable to what we're seeing, particularly within our red zone, within our red grade zone.
Hmm.
Lots of 0.4s, 0.5s, even 0.6s, 0.7s. And I mean, it's showing similar variability to Chimiwungu and certainly Lubwe.
Yes.
I think the best intercept I ever encountered when we were drilling there was like, I don't know, 9 meters at a percent or something like that, which diluted out to, 12 meters at about 0.7. So yeah, I mean, very, very similar. But again, it boils down to which zone you're talking about. If you go out into the blue zone, yeah, I mean, we're way below what they mine at Lumwana. But if you go into the red and yellow zone, I mean, we're comparable in every way,
Yes.
similar grades.
Yeah, for sure. And just between those three, like Chimi, Lubwe, and Camaranda, are each of those very similar to each other, or do they vary a bit between the three?
The main difference between Kamisengo, as it's called now, Lubwe when I
Camisengo. Yeah.
drilled it, is Lubwe Kamisengo has a lot more pyrrhotite
Nice.
than Chimiwungu. Chimiwungu's kind of, subordinate sulfide phase is pyrite with
Yes.
the odd flake of pyrrhotite. Camisengo was much more pyritite. That's really the only difference. And we're much more pyritic end of the spectrum. We do see the odd bit of pyritite, but mostly our subordinate sulfide phase is pyrite.
Yeah.
Very similar to
Excellent.
Chimiwungo, more similar to Chimiwungo than it is to Lubway
Okay.
in
There you
terms of
go.
its sulfide phase mineralogy.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of getting at. That's awesome, Kev. I think that gives people another kind of useful piece of context as well. We're about
Yeah.
15 minutes over, so I'm going to wrap it up. I want to really thank everybody for taking the time today. We will hold another one of these after the next set of assays. We'll make sure that with each round of assays we bring out, we have a chance for everybody to hear from Kevin directly and understand the importance and the significance of those assays as we go and as we continue to advance Dumbwa. I hope everybody else has a great rest of their day, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody.